Ancient Egypt is often remembered as a land of golden temples, mighty pharaohs, and eternal monuments. But beneath this image of grandeur lived millions of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by labor, fear, and survival. For peasants, slaves, and craftsmen, daily life was not glorious. It was exhausting, repetitive, and unforgiving. Most Egyptians did not live in stone palaces or rest beneath palm trees. They lived close to the Nile, bound to its floods, its cycles, and its dangers. Their lives were ruled by work from sunrise to sunset, year after year, with little hope of change. Peasants formed the backbone of Egyptian society. They worked the land, grew the grain, and fed the entire kingdom. Without them, Egypt would collapse. Yet, their lives were among the harshest. Every year, the Nile flooded the fields. When the waters receded, peasants rushed to plow the soil and plant crops before the land dried. They worked barefoot in mud and water, exposed to disease, insects, and the scorching sun. Tools were simple: wooden plows, stone blades, and sickles made from flint. The work was slow and physically brutal. Failure meant hunger, not just for the peasant, but for their entire family. Taxes were relentless. A large portion of every harvest was taken by officials of the state or the temples. If crops failed, the tax was still demanded. Inability to pay could lead to beatings, imprisonment, or forced labor. Life expectancy for peasants was low. Malnutrition, parasites, infections, and injuries were constant threats. Medical knowledge existed, but it was limited and often mixed with magic and superstition. Women worked alongside men. They ground grain for hours each day, baked bread, carried water, and raised children. Pregnancy was dangerous, childbirth deadly. Many children did not survive past early childhood. Slavery in ancient Egypt was complex. Not all slaves were treated the same, but freedom was rare.
Many slaves were prisoners of war, foreigners captured during military campaigns. Others were Egyptians who fell into debt or punishment. Slaves worked in households, fields, temples, and construction projects. Some were treated relatively well. Others endured extreme hardship. They could be beaten, sold, or reassigned at any moment. There was no illusion of choice. A slave's life belonged to someone else. Craftsmen occupied a strange middle ground. They were not peasants, yet not elite. They were skilled workers, stone carvers, metal workers, painters, and builders, essential to Egypt's monuments and temples. Many craftsmen lived in planned communities, such as the village of Deir el-Medina. There, they built tombs for kings and nobles, working under strict supervision. Their days were long, their work demanding precision and discipline. Mistakes were punished. Deadlines were enforced. Supplies could be delayed, and hunger was common even among skilled workers. Yet craftsmen had one advantage: literacy. Some could read and write, giving them a rare voice in history. From their letters and records, we learn of exhaustion, illness, and frustration with authority. Despite their skill, craftsmen were still controlled by the state. They could be reassigned, overworked, or punished if they protested. Strikes did occur, but they were desperate acts, born of starvation and neglect. Religion shaped every moment of life. The gods were believed to watch constantly. Hardship was often explained as divine will. Suffering was endured with the hope of reward in the afterlife. For peasants, slaves, and craftsmen, daily life was not about glory, it was about endurance. Surviving another flood, another harvest, another year beneath the sun. And yet, these people built one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Endurance was not a choice in ancient Egypt. It was a condition of life. For peasants, the cycle never truly ended.
When the fields were planted, there was still work, repairing canals, strengthening embankments, and maintaining irrigation systems. If the Nile failed to flood properly, famine followed. If it flooded too much, homes and crops were destroyed. In years of poor harvest, desperation spread quickly. Families sold possessions, then livestock, and sometimes even themselves into servitude. Debt could erase freedom in a single season. A bad year could determine the fate of generations. State officials kept strict records. Scribes measured fields, counted grain, and documented every harvest. Taxes were enforced with violence when necessary. Beatings were public, meant to serve as warnings. For slaves, uncertainty defined existence. A slave could be moved without warning, from a household to a quarry, from temple service to construction labor. Some worked in mines, extracting gold and copper under brutal conditions. These were places of suffering where many never returned. Female slaves faced additional dangers. They were vulnerable to exploitation, forced labor, and loss of family. Children born into slavery inherited the same fate. Freedom, when granted, was rare and never guaranteed. Craftsmen, though skilled, were not immune to hardship. Work in royal tombs and temples was physically punishing. Stone dust damaged lungs. Repetitive motion crippled hands and backs. Accidents inside narrow shafts or chambers were often fatal. Evidence from skeletons reveals broken bones, arthritis, and severe wear even in young workers. The human cost of Egypt's monuments is written into their remains. Daily rations were simple: bread, beer, onions, and dried fish. Meat was rare. If deliveries failed, hunger spread quickly, even among state workers. One of history's first recorded labor strikes occurred in Egypt. Craftsmen at Deir el-Medina stopped working, not out of rebellion, but starvation. Their protests were calm, desperate, and documented. Even skilled workers could be pushed to the edge. Childhood offered little protection. Children worked early, assisting parents in fields or workshops. Education was reserved for a small elite. Most children learned survival before learning words. Disease was constant. Parasites from the Nile infected bodies. Injuries became deadly without proper treatment. Doctors existed, but access was limited, and treatments mixed science with magic. Old age was a luxury. Those who survived long enough relied on family or community. There was no pension, no retirement. Once a body failed, life became a burden. Religion provided meaning, but also pressure. People believed suffering maintained cosmic order. To endure was to honor the gods. To complain was to risk divine punishment. Peasants prayed for floods that were neither too weak nor too strong. Slaves prayed for mercy. Craftsmen prayed for steady hands and protection from accidents. Death, however, was not the end in Egyptian belief. The afterlife promised balance, justice, and rest, if one lived properly. This belief helped people endure lives of hardship and control. And yet, it is impossible to ignore the contradiction. The temples, tombs, and pyramids that define ancient Egypt were built on exhaustion, pain, and sacrifice. They are monuments not only to kings and gods,
but to millions whose names were never carved into stone. These ordinary people fed the empire, built its wonders, and sustained its power. They lived hard lives so others could live eternal ones. Ancient Egypt was not only a land of gods and gold. It was a land of labor, discipline, and survival. And in the shadows of its great monuments, the true story of Egypt lives on, in the lives of peasants, slaves, and craftsmen who endured everything so that history would remember the pharaohs. Daily hardship in ancient Egypt was not always dramatic. More often, it was quiet, constant, and exhausting. Homes of peasants were small mud brick structures, often shared by extended families. Rooms were dark and poorly ventilated. Floors were packed earth. Animals were sometimes kept inside to protect them from theft or predators. The air was thick with dust, smoke from cooking fires, and the smell of sweat and decay. Clean water was not guaranteed. Waste was dumped nearby, attracting insects and disease. Privacy did not exist. Sleep was short and restless. At dawn, life began again. Clothing was simple linen, worn thin by repeated use. Footwear was rare. The sun burned skin, and the cold desert nights offered little relief. For slaves, even the concept of home was fragile. They lived where they were told, moved when ordered, and owned nothing, not even their own time. Their identity was tied entirely to labor. Punishment was constant, even when not carried out. The threat alone shaped behavior. Whips, sticks, and public humiliation were tools of control. Justice was swift and favored authority. Craftsmen lived with constant pressure. A cracked stone, a misaligned wall, or a damaged carving could mean punishment or loss of rations. Their skill protected them, but only barely. Emotionally, life was heavy. Hope existed, but it was limited and fragile. Most people expected nothing more than survival. Ambition was dangerous. Festivals offered brief relief. On rare holy days, food was better, beer flowed freely, and work slowed. Music, dancing, and prayer allowed people to forget their burdens for a moment. But the morning always returned. Family bonds were strong because survival depended on them. Children learned obedience early. Respect for elders was necessary, not optional. Aging was feared. When strength faded, usefulness declined. Those without family support faced abandonment. Death was ever present. Bodies were prepared as simply as life had been lived. Most could not afford proper mummification. Graves were shallow, offerings modest. Yet belief in the afterlife remained powerful. Even the poorest hoped for judgment that would finally be fair. The scales of Maat promised balance that life never gave. This belief sustained obedience. Endure now, be rewarded later. Ancient Egypt's greatness did not rise only from divine kings or sacred knowledge. It rose from exhausted bodies, disciplined lives, and unrecorded suffering. Every block of stone, every painted wall, every grain of stored wheat carried the weight of human effort. Millions lived short, difficult lives so that a civilization could appear eternal. When we admire Egypt's monuments today, we rarely think of those who bled, starved, and aged in their shadows. But without them, nothing would remain. The true foundation of ancient Egypt was not stone, it was endurance. And that endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, and relentless, is the real legacy of peasants, slaves, and craftsmen who lived and died beneath the eternal sun.